1 Corinthians chapter 5. Having dealt with the problem of division in the first 4 chapters, Paul now addresses the problem of immorality in the church at Corinth. That is, the problem of sexual immorality. In verse 1 and 2, he describes the twofold problem in the church of Corinth. Let me first describe the problem for you. In verse number 1, the problem of sexual immorality. Paul says it is actually reported that there is sexually immoral person among you. This was another major problem. And Paul says that this does not occur even among the heathen, for a man has his own father's wife. Scholars state that the Greek phrase literally says a man has his father's wife, probably his stepmother, while his father was alive. This was completely forbidden by Torah. Nothing is really said about the woman. Maybe she was an unbeliever and the man was a member of the church. Paul is very quick to comment that such kind of sin, which even pagan Gentiles would find shameful. The second problem, in verse number 2, the problem of pride. Paul rebukes them for being puffed up instead of mourning. Paul says, "And you are proud and arrogant, and you ought rather to mourn." Paul is shocked that they were so arrogant and full of pride instead of being mourning. What must be the response to this problem? In this scenario, Paul recommends a forceful response to the problem of sexual immorality of such kind. The first recommendation of Paul is that this thing or this person be removed from their fellowship and from their midst. Paul says, remove from you. It refers to church discipline. The person who has done this be removed meant he must be excommunicated from the Lord's table and out of fellowship completely. The New Testament lists at least 3 types of individuals to be dismissed from local fellowship: a constant troublemaker, an immoral person, and a heretic. In the second recommendation of Paul, Paul then instructs them to deliver this man over to Satan. We note Paul is talking about one sinner who taints the whole body of Christ or the church. He is talking of deliberate, repeated sin within the fellowship. Paul says, you are to deliver this man over to Satan. I think he means to physical discipline by Satan. Now, why does Paul give this twofold response about this problem? We should consider the why. Paul gives them reasons why this action is necessary. He gives them 2 reasons for this response. Number 1, Paul says this discipline is necessary for the good of the individual or the person who has committed this mistake. Paul uses the full weight of his apostolic authority. The reason for discipline is to help that man find his way back to God. Number 2, the reason for the disciplines is to keep sin spreading throughout the church. Now, the discipline is also necessary for the good of the church. The discipline is just not a matter for the leadership, rather for the whole gathered congregation. The behavior of an individual has affected the corporate life of a local church. Hence, discipline needs to be exercised and explained when the church is gathered as a whole. Now, what also bothers Paul is the lack of concern among the Christians about the implication of what is happening. The arrogance was one of the besetting sins of the church at Corinth. So Paul says in verse number 7, purge out, clean out the old leaven that is among you. He's referring to the Passover feast. One feature of the Passover was the search and destruction of all leaven. The purging out of all leaven was done from the home before the Passover. Leaven seems to be used here as a symbol of evil influence. Paul says, let us keep the feast because our Passover lamb is slain. Paul is telling the Corinthians to remove all the sinful and evil influence from their midst. This is urgent because they are not simply celebrating the old Passover. Remember, Christ, the Passover lamb, has been sacrificed, and therefore it is impossible for people to retain sin in their midst. But still, there is a large piece of leaven remaining in the Corinthian church. Now, finally, in chapter 5, Paul ends the chapter with some words of warning. Paul concludes with some words of warning and limiting towards whom such action is to be taken and describing how it is to be carried out in practice. Paul says, I wrote to you in my previous letter to not associated with such and such kind of people. In verse 10 and 11, he mentions several sins which break the standard of God, both outside and inside of the church. Each of the sin must be taken seriously whenever it happens. He talks about 5 areas of behavior. Number 1, sex, money, possession, drunkenness, and the tongue. May God bless you. See you in the next class.